1,040.4 feet. That is the reading a federal gauge took from the surface of Lake Mead on the morning of August 7, 2026. It is not a forecast, it is not a model projection, it is a measurement published by the Bureau of Reclamation, and it broke a record that had stood since the summer of 2022. The old mark was 1,040.58 feet, set on July 28th of that year. The reservoir has now fallen below the lowest point it has ever reached since the day the gates closed at Hoover Dam and the canyon behind it began to fill in the 1930s. 90 years of records, and the bottom of that record is where the water sits today. The number matters because of what is stacked on top of it. Lake Mead is the water bank for roughly 40 million people across 7 states and northern Mexico. J.B. Hamby, chairman of the Colorado River Board of California, put the exposure plainly when the record fell, noting that roughly 3/4 of the population of the Colorado River Basin is directly affected by what happens to this one reservoir. Jack Schmidt, who directs the Center for Colorado River Studies at Utah State University, described the moment as evidence that the basin is now in territory it has never charted before. And here is what makes this particular August different from every other bad August on this river. The recovery was supposed to hold. In 2023, a near-record snowpack and a 3 million acre-foot conservation deal lifted this lake 36 feet off the floor. Federal officials, state negotiators, and most of the coverage at the time treated that rise as breathing room. Time to build a new agreement. Time to fix the arithmetic. That breathing room is gone. And the 7 states that were supposed to spend it writing a replacement deal have not written one. Which brings us to the part of this story that the satellite images do not show. There is a date on the federal calendar, October 1st, 2026. That is when the rules that have governed this river for 19 years stop existing, and something has to be standing in their place. From today, that is 42 days away. I'm Simon, and what follows is what the imagery, the gauges, and the federal filings actually say, not what anyone would like them to say. Start with what you can see from the air, because the aerial and satellite footage from early August is the clearest visual record of this decline that exists. NASA's Worldview Archive lets you place an image of Lake Mead captured on August 5th, 2026, directly beside one from August 2000. In the older frame, the reservoir reads as a single sprawling body of water, its arms filling the drowned canyons of the lower Colorado, the Overton arm running deep and blue toward the north. In the 2026 frame, those arms have narrowed into pale threads. The Overton arm has retreated for miles. Whole bays that appear as open water in the 2000 image appear in the new one as dry, sun-bleached lakebed, the pale sediment reading almost white against the dark volcanic rock around it. Then there is the ring. Along the walls of Black Canyon and every cove on the reservoir, there is a band of mineral deposit left behind as the water pulled away, calcium carbonate bleached onto the rock by decades of contact with a higher lake. That band now stands more than 170 feet above the current waterline. To put a human scale on it, that is roughly the height of a 17-story building, wrapped continuously around hundreds of miles of shoreline. It is visible from commercial aircraft on approach to Las Vegas. It is visible in orbital imagery. It is the largest physical record of a water shortage anywhere on the planet, and it is not a historical artifact. It grew this summer. Down at the water, the footage gets more specific. The intake towers on the upstream face of Hoover Dam, 4 concrete structures, each rising from the reservoir floor, now stand exposed far above the surface, showing bands of stained concrete that spent decades underwater. At Hemenway Harbor near Boulder City, the launch ramp runs out across ground that was lakebed within living memory, and the National Park Service has been extending it in phases, moving docks and berms weekly to chase a shoreline that will not hold still. At South Cove on the Arizona side, the concrete ramp is entirely dry. Launching happens off a dirt track. Boulder Harbor is closed permanently. The launch at Overton Beach has been deactivated. That is the visual layer. Underneath it is a set of measurements that explain how the reservoir arrived here, and the sequence matters more than any single reading. It helps to remember what this structure was actually built to do. Congress authorized the Boulder Canyon project in 1928. Construction began in 1931, and the dam was completed in 1936. A concrete arch-gravity wall, standing 726 feet from bedrock to crest, 1,044 feet across the canyon, 660 feet thick at its base, and narrowing to about 25 feet at the top. It took roughly 4.36 million cubic yards of concrete, poured in interlocking vertical columns, and cooled by chilled water running through embedded pipe, because a single monolithic pour would have taken generations to cure. Before any of that could happen, 4 diversion tunnels, 50 feet in diameter and 16,000 feet in combined length, were driven through the canyon walls to move the Colorado River out of its own bed. 96 workers died in construction-related incidents during the build. The reservoir it created covers roughly 233 square miles at full pool and spans 2 time zones. It was designed to bank multiple years of Colorado River flow so that a dry stretch would draw down the account rather than empty it. That was the entire premise. The account is now down to its last quarter. Lake Mead has now fallen in every single month since February of 2026. That is an unbroken run of decline through the exact part of the year when the system is supposed to be receiving water. In a functioning year, Rocky Mountain snow accumulates through winter, peaks around the start of April, and melts from April through July, pushing a pulse of runoff down through Lake Powell and eventually into Lake Mead. That pulse is what the entire lower river budget is built around. This year, it barely arrived. The Bureau of Reclamation's April 24-month study forecast April through July unregulated inflow into Lake Powell at 1.40 million acre-feet, 22% of the 30-year average. The full water year inflow forecast sat at 3.87 million acre-feet, and Reclamation's minimum probable scenario ran lower still at 2.78 million acre-feet, which the agency described as 29% of the historical average and among the lowest figures on record. Sarah Porter, who directs the Kyle Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University, summarized the winter in a single observation when the record fell. There was very little snowpack, and the runoff that followed was one of the lowest on record. By August 12th, Lake Mead was measured at 24.7% of capacity, roughly 6.97 million acre-feet held against a total capacity of 28.26 million acre-feet. A reservoir engineered to bank several years of Colorado River flow is now holding less than a quarter of what it was built to hold. And it is still going down. Now move inside the dam, because the reservoir's elevation is not just a water number, it is an electrical one. Hoover Dam contains 17 main generating units, 9 on the Arizona wing of the powerhouse, 8 on the Nevada wing, fed through 4 penstocks embedded in the canyon walls. The plant carries a nameplate capacity of roughly 2,080 megawatts, a figure that reflects an uprating program Reclamation carried out between 1986 and 1993. That capacity was never a fixed guarantee. It is a function of hydraulic head, the vertical distance between the reservoir surface and the turbines 700 feet below. Higher lake, harder strike, more power. Lower lake, less of everything. Reclamation has stated that drought has already reduced generation at Hoover by roughly 30%. In recent operating periods, real-world output has run in the range of 500 to 600 megawatts against that 2,000 megawatt nameplate. And in the drought response package the agency announced this spring, Reclamation warned that Hoover's generating capacity could fall by up to an additional 40% as early as this fall, language that came directly from the federal agency that operates the dam, not from an outside estimate. The threshold everyone in the Southwest power sector is watching is 1,035 feet. Below that elevation, 12 of the 17 units cannot run. The problem is cavitation. When water pressure inside a turbine housing drops far enough, vapor bubbles form in the flow and then collapse against the steel of the runner blades. Each collapse is a small, violent implosion. Millions of them, hour after hour, pit and erode the metal from the inside. The units are not damaged by the low water directly. They are damaged by trying to operate in it, so they get shut down instead. Governor Joe Lombardo laid out the arithmetic when Nevada's congressional delegation announced funding for the dam this spring. Below 1,035 feet, Hoover's generating capacity drops from roughly 1,302 megawatts to about 382 megawatts. That is a reduction of roughly 70%, and what remains are 5 widehead units, engineered specifically to keep turning in low-pressure conditions. Lake Mead sat at 1,040.4 feet on August 7th. The distance from that reading to the 1,035-foot line is about 5.5 feet. It is worth knowing who actually receives that electricity because the losses do not land evenly. Under the Boulder Canyon Project allocations published by Reclamation, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California holds the single largest share at 28.54%. Nevada holds 23.37%, Arizona 18.95%, and the city of Los Angeles 15.42%, with the remainder split among Southern California Edison and a list of municipal utilities including Glendale, Pasadena, Anaheim, Riverside, Burbank, Vernon, and Boulder City. The plant generates on average about 4 billion kilowatt hours a year, enough, historically, to serve roughly 1.3 million people. When Hoover's output falls, those utilities do not simply go without. They buy replacement power on the open market, generally from natural gas generation, generally at a higher price, and generally at the moment demand across the Southwest is at its annual peak. The dam's reduced generation, therefore, does not appear to most people as a blackout. It appears as a line item. Small rural districts and tribal utilities that take a large fraction of their supply from Hoover feel that line item most sharply because they have the least capacity to absorb it and the fewest alternatives to switch to. On May 21, 2026, Reclamation announced approximately $52 million for infrastructure, operations, and maintenance work at Hoover Dam, drawn largely from post-retirement benefit funds. Part of that money is directed toward additional wide-head turbines, units that can generate at lower reservoir elevations, at an early estimated cost of $8 to $13 million apiece. Officials indicated the upgrades could restore roughly 160 megawatts of capacity. It is real money doing real engineering work. It also does not add a single acre-foot of water to the reservoir. It changes what the dam can do with a falling lake. It does not change the falling. If you're finding this useful, subscribe. We cover water systems, infrastructure, and the slow-moving engineering stories behind the landmarks people think they already understand. Here is where the story acquires a layer that most coverage of Lake Mead leaves out entirely. Part of the reason Lake Mead broke its record this summer is that federal managers chose to hold water back upstream, deliberately, in writing, knowing exactly what it would do to the lake behind Hoover Dam. 300 miles upstream sits Lake Powell, held back by Glen Canyon Dam near Page, Arizona. Powell has its own cliff edge. At elevation 3,490 feet, what Reclamation calls minimum power pool, the 8 penstock intakes lose enough submergence that the dam can no longer safely generate hydroelectricity. Reclamation operates to a target of 3,525 feet, specifically to keep a 35-foot cushion above that line. As of August 2, 2026, Lake Powell stood near 3,522 feet, holding about 23% of capacity. The cushion is already gone. Below minimum power pool, water can still leave the dam, but only through 4 tunnels called the River Outlet Works, whose intakes sit at elevation 3,374 feet. Those outlets bypass the turbines entirely and discharge through jet valves at the base of the dam. They were built for occasional use, not continuous service. When Reclamation ran them hard during a 2023 high-flow release, inspection found fresh cavitation damage inside them, and in 2024 the agency began relining all 4 in an $8.9 million project funded through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. There is a harder limit beyond the where question. Below roughly 3,440 feet, the outlet works cannot physically pass the volume the upper basin is obligated to deliver downstream each year. The bypass buys time. It buys a narrowing amount of it. So Reclamation reached for the only lever that produces immediate results. It cut the water year 2026 release from Glen Canyon Dam to Lake Mead from 7.48 million acre-feet down to 6.0 million, a reduction of nearly 1.5 million acre-feet. Alongside that, the agency arranged to move between 660,000 acre-feet and 1 million acre-feet of additional water out of Flaming Gorge Reservoir on the Green River, roughly 400 miles upstream in Wyoming and Utah, beginning in late April and running through April 2027. Together, those actions are projected to lift Lake Powell by approximately 54 feet to at least elevation 3,500 by April of 2027. Read that trade-off carefully because it is the mechanical explanation for the record that fell in August. Water withheld at Glen Canyon does not vanish. It simply does not arrive at Lake Mead. Reclamation acknowledged this directly in its own announcement, tying the upstream adjustments to the potential for an additional 40% reduction in Hoover Dam's generating capacity as early as this fall. The federal government protected one dam by drawing down the reservoir behind the other. No additional releases are planned from Blue Mesa in Colorado or Navajo in New Mexico because both are already too low, with inflow forecasts too poor to justify it. None of these measures add water to the Colorado River. They move it between reservoirs inside the same closed system on a river that has been delivering less than it promises for more than 2 decades. Las Vegas is the one place on this system that saw the shape of this coming and built for it. The Southern Nevada Water Authority's third intake number 3, the one everyone calls the third straw, sits at roughly 860 feet, drawn through a 3-mile tunnel bored beneath the floor of Lake Mead. It went live in September 2015 at a cost of around $817 million. A low lake-level pumping station followed, coming online in 2020 and reaching full operation in April 2022, adding pumping capability down to about 875 feet at a further cost of roughly $522 million. The combined investment is on the order of $1.5 billion. Dead pool at Lake Mead, the elevation at which water can no longer pass through Hoover Dam by gravity at all, is 895 feet. Southern Nevada's intake sits 35 feet below that. The city built a straw that reaches beneath the point at which the dam itself stops working. That is one metropolitan area, protecting one supply. It does nothing for Phoenix, nothing for the Imperial Valley, nothing for the tribal nations and irrigation districts downstream, and nothing for the power customers across 3 states who take electricity from Hoover. The National Park Service is planning against the same downward curve in a quieter way. Under its Sustainable Low Water Access Plan, roughly $15.7 million went toward extending the launch ramp at Hemingway Harbor to 1,000 feet, with $17.7 million allocated to relocating the ramp and marina operations at Colville Bay starting this year, and $5.1 million for Echo Bay. In its public materials, the agency stated it must be prepared to adjust if water levels decline to roughly 1,000 feet. That is a federal land management agency writing contingency plans for an elevation 40 feet below the record that just fell. Downstream of Hoover, the exposure is agricultural and it is structural. The Central Arizona project carries Colorado River water 336 miles across open desert from Lake Havasu to central and southern Arizona. Congress authorized that canal in 1968 only after Arizona accepted junior priority, meaning that in a shortage, cap water is among the first to be reduced. That concession, made nearly 60 years ago in exchange for a canal, is the reason Arizona now absorbs the largest share of lower basin cuts on paper. Under Tier 1 shortage conditions, in effect since 2022, agricultural users in Pinal County have been among the first to lose access, and farmland that grew cotton, alfalfa, and grain for decades has gone unplanted. Further downstream, in California's Imperial Valley, Colorado River water, delivered through the All-American Canal, irrigates one of the most productive winter agricultural regions in North America, a place that receives almost no rainfall and supplies a substantial share of the leafy greens and winter vegetables sold across the United States between November and March. And 30 federally recognized tribal nations hold rights within this basin, 25 of them in the lower basin. Many of those rights are senior to the state's claims, and many were quantified only after decades of litigation. They are now claims against a supply that is smaller than the one they were adjudicated from. Which brings this back to the deadline, and to the disagreement that the deadline exists to resolve. 7 states share the Colorado River under a legal architecture assembled across a century: the 1922 Compact, the 1944 Treaty with Mexico, the 2007 Interim Guidelines, the 2019 Drought Contingency Plans. The 1922 Compact divided roughly 16.5 million acre-feet a year among the states and Mexico, using flow records from an unusually wet stretch. The long-run average flow of this river is closer to 12 to 13 million acre-feet, and it has been declining. That gap is the original arithmetic error, and every negotiation since has been an argument about who absorbs it. The 2007 guidelines and the 2019 drought plans expire at the end of 2026. Replacing them was supposed to be a 7-state consensus effort, and it was not. A November 11,